Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Shining Fates, make sure you go ahead and check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using the code Omnipoke. Welcome back everyone to part 2 of the Battle Styles set review. This one is going to be talking about the V and VMAXs that we're going to be getting from the set. And as we know, the V and VMAXs typically are some of the best cards to look at for competitive play, so let's jump straight into it. First of all, you can pause now to see our ratings based on the standard format, of course, going from a 1 to 5 system on how playable we think these cards will be. And it's not just our opinion that you have to look out for. Also, going to the top right side of your screen, you will see our rating as well as the community's split decision and their most popular choice of their rating in there as well. Thanks to everyone who chipped in. We got over 100 responses, and it really does help the viewer get more than just our side of things. So thanks so much, and let's get straight into it.
So yeah, first up we have Flapple V and VMAX. Unfortunately, a little bit of an underwhelming kickoff to the set given the strength of some of these cards. But regardless, Flapple is a 190 HP V Pokemon with Sour Saliva for a Grass Energy, doing 20 damage, and your opponent's attacks next turn cost 2, well, the defending Pokemon's attacks next turn cost 2 colorless more. That can be pretty annoying in terms of being like going for a stamp play, stamp Sour Saliva. Probably means that they can't attack next turn, but the problem is Sour Saliva is doing 20 damage, so it's not really doing anything meaningful. And that you'll see when we talk about the Flapple VMAX that it's not overly sort of impressive itself, so you're not really setting anything up. Obviously, it then has the second attack wing attack for 120, which is, nothing really to write home about. The VMAX has 320 HP and has the Gmax roll attack for the same cost as wing attack, the grass double colorless, for 250 damage, minus 10 damage for each counter on this Pokemon. So we have seen Vileplume GX in Mewtwo box do well before being a 180 minus with the same effect. But that's 2 energy, and it's basically on a basic because we're copying it from Mewtwo. Well, we're using Mewtwo to copy it, which means that they don't really have time to set up some damage on the Flapple, on the Mewtwo, whereas the Flapple they can take a hit into, and all of a sudden if they're doing sort of a 150, 160 hit, you're doing 3 for 90, which is even worse than the Flapple V's attack. So that's really, really not that impressive. Feels like you're going to have to play some kind of energy acceleration with this one. The best we could think of was something like a Bronzong, where you Cheryl all the damage off, then you move an Aurora Energy and a couple of metals back onto the Flapple to do 250, but 250 for 3, when you compare it to Zacian's 230 for 3 on a basic, all of a sudden you really see how these cards don't really match up to one another. This card also has Fire weakness, which isn't great considering Fire is definitely a very, very viable archetype right now and gains a fantastic new archetype coming out of this set. So that's another big reason to kind of be fearful of this card. And the other kind of archetype you maybe could build around is, some combination of Orbitals and Flapples really leaning into Turffield Stadium to try and get set up. But at that point, it feels like you're running 2 stage 2s that both aren't necessarily underwhelming, but don't have massive synergy with one another, and typically struggle in kind of aggressive formats anyway. Orbeetle is relatively fragile, and you don't really want your Flapples getting hit because they're doing less damage. So all in all, these are pretty underwhelming cards. I do, however, know that 5-star you can see in the community rating is from someone rating the card on the art alone, which isn't how we rate cards, but in all fairness, the art for Flapple VMAX is absolutely fantastic. So I wouldn't be too sad pulling this one. There's definitely worse bad VMAXs to get, because at least you get this goofy guy. So yeah, pretty terrible competitively, but great little one to pull just for the art perspective.
Yeah, I actually spoke about Delmise from Shining Fates just a couple of days ago, and this compares even worse to that card, and absolutely no one's playing that, so yeah. We move on to Kricketune V. It's a basic 180 hit point grass type that has the ability Stage Elation. Once during a turn, you may draw until you have 3 cards in your hand. If this Pokemon is your active, you can draw until you have 4 cards instead. You can only use this ability... you can't use it if you've already used Stage Elation this turn. So it's a spiritual reprint of Instruct, one of my favorite Pokemon over the last few years. I'm a huge fan of Oranguru, shoved it into all sorts of decks. If anyone's been following the channel long enough, you'll know that if there's a will, there's a way. I will make that one space for Oranguru, even when he's not wanted. And I'm feeling the same vibes with Cricketune, to be honest with you. I feel like this is such a great stamp proofing card. The format right now, the reason Pikarom is one of the top decks, if not the top deck in the game, is the power of Stamp Choo Choo. And Cricketune being a way for you to draw until you have 3 is fantastic. And then if something's been knocked out and he's got a U-turn board or an air balloon on, shove him in the active, get yourself some extra card draw in there as well. I think currently there is some stiff competition from Oricorio GX. And that could be something keeping Cricketune from a ton of archetypes right now. But at the same time, people in Center Scorch have been committing to a 2/2 Silvally line, which gives me real optimism for this card to see play as just that one-of include, which is pretty cool. So I think this could find its way into a ton of decks, just like how we've seen Crobat, Dedenne, Eldegoss. I feel like Cricketune is lower down that list than those 3, but still maybe worth it, especially in aggressive archetypes. This also does open up the backdoor for some Rose-based engines. If you were to play like 3 or so Cricketoons in your deck, you could try and leave him in the active position, and then Rose to your VMAX, and then Cricketoon in your hand back up straight away, which is far less spaces than Silvally, which would previously have been your choice outside of like Rose Tower, which you could never really rely on because of the amount of swell in the game. So this does open up the door for Rose engines, which previously has been a bit of a meme. I think I've seen some what's it called? The dangerous canned goods builds of Dragapult using Rose, and I've seen Inteleon Rose a little bit here and there, but getting those spaces means that you can just be more consistent and more flexible as well. So some of these VMAXs that have been underutilized may have a breath of fresh air thanks to Cricketune making Rose more usable. I think that's still on the rogue side of things, but it's at least an enabler and worth talking about.
Definitely. Next up, we have Victini V and VMAX, and I mentioned how Fire was getting another good archetype. Well, once again, they're giving Fire an archetype that doesn't necessarily need to hit Welder on the first 2 turns of the game, which is absolutely crazy given how strong Welder is. Imagine having a Fire archetype that isn't actually that fussed about Welder in certain situations, so that's crazy. Victini V, it's not a reprint, it's actually a new Victini V, which is interesting. Similar HP, 190, a 1 energy attack. V Bullet does 10 plus 50 if the opponent's active Pokemon is a V. At least it's targeting the 2 prize stuff, I guess. That would feel super bad if it was a Pokemon without a rule box, so that's nice at least. And Flare Shot doing 120 for 2 actually isn't terrible, but obviously we already have the Energy Burst Victini V, which for 2 energy does 30 damage times the number of energy attached to both active Pokemon. So if the opponent has 2 energy on them, you're going to be doing the same amount of damage. You don't have to discard the energy, but that's also scalable on their end and on your end. So typically, you're probably going to be getting more value out of the Energy Burst because you also have access to Spreading Flames as a setup attack. So I don't think Victini V is a particularly bad card. It's just outshone by the one we already have. Victini VMAX has 310 HP, which, as I've mentioned, is a little bit fragile, but regardless, it doesn't really matter, I don't think. Has a similar attack, Spreading Flames, as its first attack, which is just identical to the Victini V's attack, so obviously nice, more utility is always great. But Max Victory is really where this card shines. For 2 energy, a fighting in a colorless, you do 100 damage, and if the opponent's active Pokemon is a Pokemon V, this attack does 120 more. And now, all of a sudden, if you start the game, this is already a Fire deck that actually likes going first. If you start the game, you can go attach, turn 2, you attach, evolve, you've got a Victini VMAX, you can then boss basically any V Pokemon that your opponents attach an energy to and knock it out in most scenarios. There's not too many V Pokemon that live 220, and I think I counted 4, and none of them are seeing play right now. So that alone is insane, and it puts your opponent behind on so much tempo in a format where one attachment can make or break. People are playing hammers to get rid of one attachment to potentially swing the game. Well, this Victini VMAX can get rid of one attachment as well as take 2 prizes. That's just insane. You have the backdoor of having a Welder engine if you want, things like Reshi, Zard, and Cramorant. In the mid game, you can go Max Victory early game, Double Blaze for another really nice tempo attack on sort of a mid-range style Pokemon, a 2 prizer, and then Cramorant sniping at a Dedenne for game. And all of a sudden, you've got very, very consistent prize mapping where you need 2 Welders rather than 3 or 4, and you don't need them early game. So you can spend your early game playing Dedennes, playing Researchers, stuff like that. As long as you get into that boss turn 2, you're going to be put in such a strong position. So yeah, being able to play a Welder deck that doesn't necessarily need Welder. It can play Welder going second. You can set up a Victini and then attach to a bench Victini, and basically you're guaranteeing you're going to have a VMAX ready to attack next turn if they're able to take a knockout. Is obviously good. You're not going to not play Welder in this deck. But again, we've said in the past, Center Scorch is another deck that obviously massively benefits from hitting Welder in the early turns, but doesn't need to at all. If you can, in Center Scorch's case, use Volcanion to set up, you can get by in the game without using a Welder for the first couple of turns and still definitely be in a position where you can win the game. And that's kind of how Victini feels, but it's way more aggressive than a Flare starter. It's actually taking 2 prizes. It's just a massive tempo swing. And I think Victini turn 2 boss is going to be a very, very threatening thing that you're going to have to think about in the format. And you're maybe going to have to think about things like EXP share that we've mentioned in the past, in the previous video, to try and just mitigate the fact that if they can hit boss on your 1 energy attachment on your V that you're setting up, you don't just lose the game. It's going to force things like EXP share. I keep forgetting the name of that card. It's going to force things like EXP share into lists maybe just to try and not get absolutely punished by just turn 2 boss max victory, basically winning the game from there. So yeah, a fantastic card, and one that I think is very easy to gloss over. I've heard a lot of people really not that impressed with this card, but a lot of people have also seen it for what Joe and I have seen, and we think it is definitely going to be a threat in the format.
Essentially, the only thing keeping me from giving this a 5-star is that I think Rapid Strike Urshifu will see a lot of play, which naturally plays Empoleon, and they can just increase that count to make the matchup a lot harder. But I adore this card. I think it is one of the scariest decks to come up against if you're an evolving VMAX style deck yourself. Like you say, with like the Jirachi package that Welder decks already really enjoy playing, you have pretty consistent turn 2 boss knockout on, a baby Dragapult, a baby Urshifu, a baby Eterna. That's terrifying. Obviously, Pikarom leaves Bolton in the active position for you, and even if you think that max victory gets into terrible damage as soon as they put tag teams in the way, the great thing is you've got Welder supplying you with the Energy Burst, Victini V, Reshizard, Cramorant. These can all chip in, so I like that you don't need to Welder in the opening stages. It means you can play super aggressive. Really reminds me of Zoroark, actually, how they would try and boss Grinch whatever your opponent was powering up in certain situations on that turn 2. Because of the low maintenance nature of Victini, it just opens that door for you so nicely. So I actually think this will surpass Center Scorch in the meta as the best VMAX Fire deck that we have, just because it works way better when you're bricking, because you can at least Energy Burst and you can at least Spreading Flames if you've got nothing else going for you. And it's just more dangerous to be bossing things in this meta for sure. So I adore the card. I'm just a little bit afraid of how much natural water there will be in the game, which Center Scorch hasn't had to worry about up until now. So yeah, Victini, insane. I adore it. I'm going to be getting these cards for sure. And can't really say much more on that. We will now talk about Empoleon V, and that's good timing, I guess, because I've just been saying that I believe it will see play in Urshifu, and that's why we're going to be giving it that 4-star rating. I don't think it will necessarily go into every Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX deck, and I think many times it will just be a 1/2 count, but he serves some great purposes. It has 210 hit points, it's a water type, and obviously a Rapid Strike tag on it as well, so it can use Rapid Strike Energy, which is pretty crucial here. It has the Swirling Slice attack for water and 2 colorless. You do 130 and you move an energy from this Pokemon to one of your bench. So you can power this up in a turn with Welder attach Rapid Strike, or Welder attach a water energy if you really wanted to. You can use Dance of the Ancients with Koko. You can use Turbo Patch and Rapid Strike. So there's a number of ways you can get this going in one turn, even if you are just playing the bog standard Rapid Strike energy plus like Stone Fighting plus basic fighting, or even like Capture Energy. You can play 1 or 2 of in your deck if you really choose to help you get early access to Remoraid, which could be really good as well, by the way. You can be Swirling Slicing on 2. It sounds expensive, but because you're moving that one back, it's a powered up Y-Cyclone, and when you're powering up Urshifus, that's really, really good for you. So, this Empoleon is way more efficient than he looks on the outset. He's way more aggressive than he looks on the outset. His type coverage is great. Center Scorch and Victini would otherwise be horrific matchups for Urshifu VMAX. And having something that can hit 260 into them sets them up really nicely for a G-Max Rapid Flow or a Gale Thrust the following turns. So yeah, really influential for that matchup, and it's going to make Urshifu super relevant in the game, because right now, Center Scorch is one of the top decks and Eternatus is one of the top decks, the two flagship VMAXs of the format, and Urshi is coming in and hitting for weakness on both of those just out the gate is pretty wild. On top of that, you also have Cream on top. That's the Emperor's Eyes ability. As long as this Pokemon is in the active spot, your opponent's basic Pokemon in play have no abilities except for Pokemon with a rule box. So you're specifically targeting Jirachis, Snorlaxes, Celebes, these sorts of cards. And yeah, I think that's a good deal for you as well. This can be disruptive into Blacephalon, which I think is really, really gross, actually, because you can deny them from early aggressive turns and set up G-Max Rapid Flow, which is going to be so horrific for them to deal with, by the way. So that's a really big deal. Also, Swelling Slice can hit 260 with just a Zigzagoon ping, which we've already established you'll play one of in Urshifu. Means you can one-shot Reshizard as well, which is a big card currently in the format, and I think possibly bigger, because there could be a Welder-based Urshifu deck out there as well. We've mentioned it a couple of times, and I do think it will be possible for that to be a list. So, yeah, so much love about Empoleon. There's a handful of decks out there that are trying to rely on Snorlax, rely on Jirachi, and having just early denial of that is pretty sad for some decks, to be honest. So super duper good card. Even if it only ends up being a one-of, it's going to be a super important one-of for a ton of matchups.
Next up, we have Koko V and VMAX. Another VMAX that we already had a V of in the past, so pretty interesting that we've got two of these in the same set. Unfortunately, this one is a lot more underwhelming, though. Tapu Koko V has 10 more HP than its Sword and Shield predecessor. It has a couple of interesting attacks. Electro Ball is just 1 for 40, but Spiral Thunder for 3 energy does 20 plus 40 for each energy attached to all of your opponent's Pokemon. In the past, effects like that have been very, very strong, but it feels like there's only a couple of decks right now that really flood the board with energy. Things like Pikarom and some of the fire decks can often be in a situation where they've got a lot of energy on board. So it feels like you're not having sort of that massive impact as you have been in the past. There's a couple of decks, things like Eternatus, that are only going to be having 1, 2, maybe 3 energy on board. And similarly with the Urshis, they actually discard on energy attached themselves. So whilst this effect has been powerful in the past, it's just a lot more underwhelming here. I think in general, this is also just a little bit worse than Koko V anyway. 3 for 200 is just clean. You also have free retreat on the old one, as well as spike draw to help you in a pinch when you've been reset stamped. So I think, unfortunately, this one is another one that falls prey to being a little bit worse than the Sword and Shield version of itself. But alas, it did get at least a VMAX to look at as well. 320 HP with a 3 energy attack, max shock, for 180. And if you're behind on prizes, your opponent's active Pokemon is now paralyzed. Now, auto paralysis has been very strong in the past, especially given that we're in a format where Stamp is basically one of the strongest at one of the strongest points it's ever been, and Pikarom is doing so well right now because they are the only deck that has access to consistent Stamp Paralyze, win the game next turn. So first impressions do make this combo look pretty interesting, especially as we have things like Electrode to go behind on prizes, similarly to things like Miss Magius that have worked in the past, where you go behind on prizes to get an effect and also get a bonus effect in terms of your attack. So it's pretty interesting that all of these things seem to be quite sort of strong. Unfortunately, we've found in our testing that you need to develop 2 Koko VMAXs really to be able to put yourself in a position where you can win, which means you probably have to pop 2 Electrodes, and that means you can never really lose another prize, because if you pop 2 Electrodes and a Tapu Koko VMAX goes down, you basically you can't ever be bossed or anything like that, because you're only going to have 1 prize left. Obviously, that does open the door for you to be able to go into sort of Stamp Paralyze, but in the early game, 180 just isn't really doing enough for you to be able to play the aggressive role and kind of put your opponent on a clock like something like a Pikarom can do, because Pikarom typically early can go aggressive with things like Tag Bolt or Boltund, and then immediately retract back to the back foot and go, okay, Stamp, Paralyze with Raichu, and just hit through something twice for my last 3 prizes. So unfortunately, because Koko doesn't really have that massive aggressive lead that it can deal with, the first 3 prizes on a VMAX quite as efficiently as just a Bolton just one-shotting one. It's a little bit underwhelming, unfortunately. Obviously, you can play like a green style engine with this kind of card, and we've seen sort of greens Raichu along with Omastar work in the past, and there have been some moments in situations in the matchups that we've played where the deck kind of just does function. It gets all its combo pieces. It sets up 2 Tapu Koko VMAXs. It probably doesn't need to use a second Electrode, and all of a sudden they can just get through by max shocking every turn. The difficulty is, unfortunately, eventually you're not going to be guaranteeing paralysis, because eventually you're going to take prizes on whatever you're paralyzing, and then your opponent's going to be ahead on prizes. Your opponent's going to be behind on prizes again, and you don't get the paralysis effect, so you're not really doing anything. But also, it's actually quite a big combo, it turns out, and it's not the easiest of combos to pull off, especially if you're trying to weave in this Omastar package as well. So a very interesting card, and I think it's one that deserves a lot of talk considering how underwhelming it's been, because there's a lot of pieces that have all been very, very powerful in the past here, but right now it's just not quite the format for them, and not quite like I say, the pieces haven't quite fallen into alignment at the right time, which is quite unfortunate, because it could be interesting to see kind of a play from behind stamp style deck that's not Pikarom, that can go aggressive, that always wants to be behind. It would be quite interesting to see that, but yeah, I don't think it quite fits the bill in the current meta we're in.
Yeah, I think its early game is just super vulnerable from our testing. Even if you are hitting that combo, you don't have that much draw to fall back on, so you're just kind of hoping that Omastar being in play and the Koko in the active is doing enough. And that's in a format with so many switch outs. Obviously, both Rapid and Single Strike Urshifu coming onto the scene isn't going to be great for this. Normally, you're having to commit Catch Energy as your colorless energy just to get like early Voltorbs and your backup Koko into play, so you can't really easily play Weak Guard, or if you are, you're sacrificing something. And I think the precedent's been set with Choo Choo that it's best just in Pikarom than building an Electrode stamp deck around it. There's obviously upsides to Koko in comparison to Choo Choo, mostly just hit points and the fact that you don't have to jump in and out, but Raichu even gains like Escape Rope, so you could probably just build Choo Choo Trode if you want to instead. So a ton of reasons why I don't think this is going to work, despite being quite a glamorous card. Next up we have Mimikyu V. It's a 160 hit point Psychic type V Pokemon that has the Dummy Doll ability. You may use the ability once during a turn. When you play this card from your hand onto your bench until the end of your opponent's next turn, prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from your opponent's Pokemon. So it's a turn of immunity, which is really nice, and it has a 1 energy attack. So ideally, you put this into play, you attach to it the turn that you're going to use that Dummy Doll, and you're going to throw it into the active and use the Envying Eyes attack, which places 3 counters on your opponent's active for each of the prize cards your opponent has taken. So ideally, this is coming down after your opponent's taken 4 or 5 prizes. The Mimikyu's in the way, you're playing a stamp, you're making them have ropes and bosses to target other things than Mimikyu to take those final prize cards. Envying Eyes, hopefully just setting up damage in that active, 120, 150 damage, which means that you could then have a follow-up attacker that can close out that game. And just having a 1 psychic cost means that there's only a handful of decks this could really go into. Dragapult is known for being a stamp kind of deck and obviously plays psychic energies. Mewtwo and Mew tag team has played Aurora energies as well as sometimes Horror energies, so there could be a home for Mimikyu there. And I think possibly one of the most interesting would be like Whimsicott, just trying to buy yourself a free turn, because there certainly can be those situations where you just didn't get your backup Cottony down or something like that, so you can just sort of panic button put down Mimikyu. Obviously, the Whimsicott deck is less likely to play stamps, so you're just trying to randomly buy yourself that free turn. And even if your opponent does have Gust, they're only taking 1 prize in a lot of situations because you've probably got your Island Challenge Amulets established, or you just have 1 prizes in play. So kind of hopeful in a lot of situations, this Mimikyu. We do think the Dragapult has a lot more license to be better in the upcoming format, because in theory, the fighting decks coming into the format, they have Psychic Weakness, although they probably will play Jirachi GX. That's a low hit point Pokemon that you can max Phantom onto regardless. And there's going to be more Mewtwo trying to deal with Urshifu. and with the amount of fighting, there may be less Eterna. So in a weird way, the gears are shifting in Dragapult's favor in terms of the matchup spread. We don't necessarily think Mimikyu has to go in that deck list at all. So it's kind of like this optional one-of that could be used if you are leaning into that stamp quite a bit. It also really depends on just the amount of rope in the meta. We're expecting it to be pretty big, just in like ADP decks, Urshifu decks, and a few other things that just naturally play like Jirachi and other stuff like that. We think rope will, be around a 2+ count in a lot of decks, and that does render the dummy doll pretty useless. But that's why we're rating it quite low, but there are a few potential homes for it currently in the game.
Next up, we have Necrozma V. Necrozma is another psychic Pokemon, 220 HP with the first attack Prism Ray, doing 20 and 20 with your opponent's bench for 1 energy. That's a pretty nice attack, to be honest. It's a similar amount to sort of a Hammerhead style attack, but it's actually 3 targets rather than 2, so there'll be certain situations where that'll be pretty niche but nice. Second up, we have Special Laser. For 3 energy, does 100 plus 120 more if this Pokemon has any special energy attached to it. So 220 for 3 is pretty good on a basic. Obviously, we've seen Zacian do pretty well. This is conditional, but it's still something worth noting. Any psychic weak Pokemon you're going to be one-shotting, which is obviously fantastic if you're ignoring things like Jirachi GX. So that's pretty good. Unfortunately, this card basically falls down because there's no great acceleration for it. And I think in a format where we do have good acceleration for it, this could actually be a very strong attacker. There's a lot of cool special energy right now. Horror energy and capture energy come to mind as ones that are just good anyway. But even kind of a Bronzong Metal Transing Aurora energy onto the Necrozma means that Special Laser would be live for the maximum amount of damage. So there's a lot of cool sort of niche ways you can get this online, but just inherently not having a huge amount of energy acceleration means that every time a Necrozma goes down, it's probably going to be 1 or 2 turns, or 2 or 3 turns, I should say, before the next one's coming out swinging, and that's just not quick enough. It's nowhere near quick enough in this format. We have seen a couple of there's been 1 or 2 resurgence players of like Psychic Mewtwo decks. Back when Malamar hadn't rotated, that was obviously a very, very popular archetype, but now they have to focus on things like this Rotom, which just is so much more effort, so much kind of, it's just nowhere near as powerful as being able to just Malamar energy on. And I think that's going to be what holds Necrozma back for now. Maybe you even have to play something like EXP shares just to try and keep the Necrozmas kind of churning. But even then, playing EXP shares means that obviously you can only keep basics with the EXP share. You can't keep the specials, so you're still going to have to find a new special energy every turn. Obviously, you're going to be playing a lot in this side of deck because that's kind of what you're going to be needing. But even so, it all just sounds a little bit too complicated for the amount of payoff you're getting when we have something like a Zacian, which is doing 10 more damage for basically no condition. So yeah, right now, it's really unfortunate. It's a 1-star card, but we can definitely see this being powerful in the future if we ever get some strong psychic acceleration again. I don't think we'll be seeing Malamar again anytime soon. They've done psychic type energy acceleration from the discard. They won't do it again for a while. But even kind of like psychic style Rain Dance could be enough to make this, at least not bulk. So right now, it's just not the meta for it. There's no real way to power these up consistently. But when there is, 220 on a basic Pokemon isn't really that bad compared to some of the attacks we see right now. So one to maybe keep your eye on if Psychic type ever gains some strong acceleration.
And that brings us on to the fighting types, probably the main highlights of the set. And first up is Rapid Strike Urshifu V and VMAX. The basic Urshifu V has 220 hit points and has 2 attacks. The first is for 1 fighting energy, Strafe. You do 30 and switch to the bench, which is good utility actually. A little prod here and there, not too bad. And you're most importantly protecting your energy attachment for turn if you're going second, which is pretty nice. And you also have the 100 Furious Blows for 2 fighting and 1 colorless. You do 150. Again, reasonable and surprisingly fast to get rolling. Again, like we keep saying, we imagine that this could be built just having 1 attachment per turn, but there's also so much acceleration available that you could be doing a turn 150 if you wanted to, with the attachment of a Rapid Strike energy, plus, a Koko or a Welder, one of those could mean you can do an early 150 damage, which isn't something to sleep on. However, the all-star is this VMAX. We've talked about it already a ton. You can see the community are all fully on board as well. 1 energy, Gale Thrust does 30, and when you move from the bench to your active, you do 120 more damage. So again, the Strafe has synergy there for you inbuilt, which is really nice. And 150 for 1, super duper efficient. We've seen this effect before on Golisopod GX. It was a staple in the format for a long time. Part of it was because of its type coverage into Lycanroc, but partly because it was just so dang efficient anyway. And then you have the second attack, which is just mind-boggling. For 2 fighting and a colorless, discard all energy from this Pokemon. This attack does 120 to 2 of your opponent's Pokemon. You don't apply weakness and resistance to the bench, of course. But if you bring up things like Crobats and Dedennes, you can do that 120 to the active that then gets doubled for a 2-prize knockout, whilst also setting up or finishing off the Tag Team GX Pokemon. So I really think this was built specifically to be a huge threat for Tag Team GXs, because the numbers are just so perfect here. Doing 150 into 120 is excellent, even into things like Mewtwo, thanks to you having Jirachi GX probably on your side here. You can quite easily 2-shot the Mewtwo, whilst also doing a bench spread, which can either set up the next Mewtwo to get knocked out, or to start putting damage on Dedennes or Crobats, or again, if you're gusting it into the active, pushing the Mewtwo to the back, you can take those like 5-prize swings in many situations. What I love about sniping is that you can play around Stamp quite well as well. It means you're not just crossing your fingers for boss off of a Stamp to 2. You can sit with game potentially on board in a ton more situations, especially if you have Artillery developed, which is just crazy, crazy good for this card. And again, is really pulling us out of that Stamp being like the win con for a ton of decks, which is currently the case. So yeah, Rapid Strike, G-Max Rapid Flow is just such a ridiculous attack. Like we've already mentioned, there's Empoleon to help out against some of the fire decks, which are more awkward, and again sets up that Rapid Flow for great damage. So yeah, I'm expecting a ton of different ways for this to be played. I'm expecting other VMAXs to also just randomly be playing Urshifu VMAX with Rapid Strike energy, because its numbers are just so intense. And Dedenne and Crobats, you know, the game can't function without those for many decks, so they have to be put into play for a lot of people. There's a ton of 1-prize Pokemon that sort of live in fear of this card as well. Will Mew be coming back into decks? Quite possibly, but even then your opponent's committing resources to getting Mew into play rather than other cards that they'd want, and it's committing a board space to them. And even then you can just Gust and Gale Thrust it anyway to knock it out, and then they also need to be playing Super Odds and all this other stuff. So yeah, Rapid Strike Urshifu, possibly the best attacker that we have in the game right now. It's actually that good.
Yeah, it's you can tell by the fact that we've got like all five of those cards you can see on the right hand side are essentially different archetypes you can build this card around, and that, I promise you, that won't be all of them. There will be things we've missed. There will be things that will develop as the format develops. There will be new things come out over the next 2 years whilst this card is in standard, and they will all be considerations to pair with this card. So yeah, I think this is, like Joe says, one of the best, if not the best attacker in the game right now coming out of the format, basically because it grinches Dedennes and Crobats so hard, but also, like you say, it's just an absolute tag team killer. So yeah, I cannot wait to play with this card on day one. And they're going to be expensive, but they're going to be so, so powerful. And similarly, another very, very powerful archetype is the single strike Urshifu V and VMAX. Not quite the 5-star card that the Rapid Strike is, but still at least we think going to be a tier 2 archetype and one to keep your eye on. The basic has 220 HP and has laser focus for its first attack, letting you search for up to 2 fighting energy and attach them to this Pokemon. That alone is very, very good. It can be very threatening, especially to some of the more passive decks, things like ADP. If you're going second into an ADP and you laser focus, they really do not want to GX into you, because basically you evolve, attach a single strike energy, and you just blow up their ADP, and all of a sudden they're relying on sources for the rest of the game to 2-shot through single strikes, and they don't even want to do that because then they're setting up Raging Scroll. So this, like that alone, laser focus into ADP alone may justify this up like being a 3, even 4-star card. But then you have Laser Impact and the whole VMAX package as well, and the whole Single Strike package as well. You can already see that this is another fantastic card. Impact Blow does 180, and as we mentioned in the trainer video when we were talking a lot about some of these single strike cards, this Impact Blow makes it so that this deck can trade 2 prizes with the V, 3 prizes with the VMAX, or 1 prizes with things like Houndoom, which is obviously very strong. Doing 180 plus essentially because of your access to single strike energy means that you can basically go toe to toe with any of the pure V decks. You can pretty consistently trade with them, and you've got acceleration, so you maybe only need 1 attachment per turn, which is really nice. But then you've also got the backdoor into the VMAX, which has 330 HP and has a couple of great attacks. Beatdown for 100 may not seem particularly flashy, but because it's just 3 energy, there's no conditions, there's nothing like that. You can just gust and beat down at a Dene or a Crobat and knock it out for 2 prizes. Very, very simple. You don't need a huge wombo combo for that. You're going to have 3 energy by the time you're getting into the VMAX pretty consistently. So you're just looking for boss. So that, whilst it may seem pretty underwhelming, it's not 1 for 150. Well, 3 for 100, it turns out it's fine when dealing with some of these other sort of 2 prize Pokemon, because Gmax 1 Blow deals with the tag teams just fine. For 270 damage, you discard all 4 of the energy you've got attached to you, and this also wall breaks as well. So this is kind of the VMAX, the single strike, way of dealing with tag teams. You've got Urshifu going through 2, you've got single strike Urshifu going through one at a time, and the rapid strike Urshifu doing like 2 little hits, which is, like you say, it kind of shows that they're really leaning into us playing these VMAX archetypes rather than the tag team archetypes. So that alone, like the card alone, is very, very impressive. You've also got this plethora of different single strike cards that support it. Houndoom being energy acceleration, the single strike energy being damage buff, but also things like Tower of Darkness and Raging Scroll really make this kind of deck the whole package, which is great. Obviously, you've got Jirachi to be able to mitigate that psychic weakness and live hits against Mewtwo's and things like that. So you can even sort of go for a Gmax 1 Blow, take a big hit on your end, maybe from a Zacian or a Reshizard, something like that. Then just attach a Raging Scroll and attach a single strike energy, and all of a sudden you're threatening another VMAX KO, not a VMAX KO, a tag team KO, I should say, for 1 energy and winning the game from there. So obviously that is very, very strong. The reason why we've dropped it down to a 4-star is because we have found it slightly more underwhelming in terms of consistency than the Rapid Strike archetype. Typically, there's not really going to be much flexibility in terms of archetypes you can build with this. It's not as flexible as Rapid Strike. You're going to be seeing Houndoom, you're going to be seeing Vitality Jar, you're going to be seeing the Scroll and Tower of Darkness. And these are all fantastic cards, but it means, there's not going to be many tricks you can pull. And also, the more we've played this, the more we've felt it's been like Ultra Malamar from back in the day, where you're setting up a load of stage 1s to try and just blow up whatever's in the active with your big attacker. And that hasn't been the most consistent archetype in the past. And now your main attacker is a stage 1 rather than a basic, and has to have 4 energy rather than 2. So you don't have that flexibility that Ultra Malamar sometimes had, but you probably do have higher breakpoints. So it's a weird one. It's like you're trading sort of different things. You're trading consistency for a bit of higher damage output. And in most scenarios, that's actually pretty good, especially as HPs are getting higher. But we have found that in certain circumstances, the list to be a little bit more clunky than a lot of the Rapid Strike variants, just because Octillery is inherently increasing your consistency in those variants, whereas Houndoom is just setting up your attacker. And even though they're very powerful effects, setting up your consistency is obviously way stronger than setting up your attacker, because your consistency keeps you in the game, whereas your attacker means that you're more likely to be in something like top deck mode or getting stamped and really hoping to draw out of the stamp, something like that. So whilst all of these cards are so strong, and you'll see we rate Houndoom very, very highly as well, unfortunately, the pieces don't quite fall into alignment just as much as the Rapid Strike, but that doesn't mean this archetype is bad at all. This is going to be a tier 2 archetype, we're pretty sure, and just the power level of the attacks alone, the power level of the engine alone, means that basically it's one of those decks where if you're not able to keep up, you will just lose. This will be a deck that can just churn out wins because turn 2 they're dealing 1 max blow, turn 3 they're raging scrolling, turn 4, providing everything's going okay, they're probably winning the game. So if you can kind of disrupt their consistency, you're going to be looking for a little bit of a better time. But if left unchecked, I think Single Strike is definitely another very, very powerful archetype, and one that will probably check a lot of decks, and if nothing else, keep ADP also in check, because being able to laser focus into an ADP pre-GX, I think, is almost backbreaking for them.
Yeah, I agree. Any of those sort of passive decks, laser focus will be insane against them. And we say 4-star as if we're hating on it, but that's just because how insane Rapid Strike is. Don't get me wrong, like, Single Strike is going to be very solid. It sweeps aside a ton of tag teams. It, like you said, it has a 2-prize attacking option that's a genuine threat on its own, a 3-prize attacking option, and Houndoom can be a 1-for-1 trader as well against any levelable-based variant. So there's a ton of things where you get to play your 60 cards, and that 60 cards, like, is kind of out the box all out of this set, and you just jam in all the cards that say Single Strike, essentially. But that works. That's, like, all you need to do, and thanks to wall breaking naturally, you don't need to put any scuffed techs in. You just play your main attackers, your thick Houndoom line, your scrolls, your energies, all that sort of stuff, and that's it. That's all you need. Whereas the Rapid Strike, you know, it's going to take bad matchups here and there. It's going to have more awkward answers to Zamazenta and to like Decidueye and that sort of thing, whereas this one kind of just shrugs it off and punches through. So there's a lot to like about the Single Strike as well. Don't get it twisted. This card is still very powerful. Next up, we come on to Tyranitar V. It's also a Single Strike attacker, and it's actually very similar to the Urshifu V Max. The biggest issues here, and why we're rating it a 1-star rather than that 4-star, is that firstly, you don't have laser focus. So if you come up against anything playing Crushing Hammers, this attack cost is going to be really, really bad for you. Cragalanche is 3 energies. You're doing 60, but probably more so around that 100 mark, just because of the amount of Single Strike energies will be attached to him, and you discard the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck, which is a nice upside. And the sort of main attack, in air quotes, is for 2 dark, 2 colorless, 240 damage, and discard the top 4 cards of your deck. First of all, that top 4 cards is pretty awkward. We've seen it with Excadrill, obviously, in the current standard meta, and it does warp the deck in a weird way where you have to play a ton of like rods and pal pads and that sort of thing. So straight away, Tyranitar has to build weirdly, and will still be very reliant on Houndoom for its acceleration. So you need to have a ton of these in play. You probably also need to play your rods and stuff just in case you accidentally discard your Houndooms or your Vitality Jars, that sort of thing, which is terrible. And ultimately, you know, this 240 jumping to 280 is great in tag team meta, of course, but you're still not getting close to V and VMAXs, so a lot of that damage can be wasted, and Tyranitar just gets knocked out too easily. So again, if he sort of trades that sort of 3 prizes for 2 prizes, you can still just be twiddling your thumbs for a turn, because you're having to just use like Cragalanche or pass into your opponent while you're building up to Single Strike Crush, and then they can just gust and kill you. So that could happen in a lot of situations. You're going to falter to hammers. You're not going to be a big enough guy just to sit on the board and waste turns. There's a ton of ways to like accelerate in quite scuffed means, like using Axu XP Share Nanu or using Weavile Red and Blue to try and keep him ticking over. But Houndoom's still the best accelerator, so these would have to be in addition to Houndoom, which is really difficult to see. I think one of the only other things I could think about is how well you could use Piers. Seeing as though you have colorless in your attack cost, you can play Capture Energies to get extra Houndowers into play, whilst also having Piers in the mid game to get you into Houndooms, which is a super big deal. And Hooper could possibly be that guy that just finishes things off after a big Single Strike Crush, so you're not just passing into people, you're then setting up the next VMAX or poking something that you've previously damaged, that sort of thing, taking a 1-prizer out. So that would be the only way I see Tyranitar seeing play. At the moment, I'm not foreseeing Hammers and Billowing Fans going anywhere. I think they're just still very good in the meta, and it's just more steps than Urshifu, despite being a basic, because you don't have laser focus on your side. So a few consistency issues there as well.
Next up, we have Corviknight V and VMAX, and this is another great VMAX from the set. Corviknight V has 210 HP, has the clutch first attack for 1 energy, doing 30 and stopping your opponent retreating. That can be pretty useful in certain scenarios. And then Sky Hurricane for 190, does 190 for 3, which obviously isn't quite as strong as Zacian's attack, but at least isn't unusable. However, Corviknight VMAX is the big one here. 320 HP, Gmax Hurricane doing 240 damage for 3. and you can't use G-Max Hurricane next turn, so similar attack to Zacian's text, as well as that Luster Body ability preventing all effects of your opponent's abilities done to this Pokemon, as well as Free Retreat, which is definitely notable. So the way we foresee this sort of playing out is obviously Luca Metal is one of the top sort of 6 or 7 decks in the format right now. You'd probably put it in a high tier 2 kind of position. We actually see a Corviknight line and maybe even, well, essentially also the Bronzong line fitting into kind of a mash between Luca Metal and this deck and becoming sort of a Luca Metal early game into Corviknight late game, but also having like the backup of Zacian's incredible tempo in the mid game if you're just going kind of hyper aggressive. The combination of Luca Metal and or Goggles as well as Cheryl can make Corviknight very, very difficult to deal with. And if you're able to establish 2 Corviknights, which may be difficult, but definitely doable, you can essentially just switch between 2 Corviknights, doing 240 every turn and healing for a couple of turns, using a Cheryl once or twice to wipe off your opponent's energy, your opponent's damage, I should say, without losing the energy because you can just Metal Transit to other Pokemon. All of a sudden, you have a very, very strong defensive archetype. Things like Copperaja VMAX and Sizzle VMAX are never really seen play, but that's because they haven't had this kind of big blow-up attack, I feel. They haven't had the flexibility of Free Retreat. They haven't had the nice ability on top. It feels like Corviknight really is the whole package, and having Metal Trans to be able to supplement that tankiness is definitely going to be useful. Luster Body prevents things like Giratina discarding your coating energy as well, so all of a sudden your fire matchups that Luca Metal typically is pretty worried about, even despite playing coating metals. We've even seen Luca Metals playing things like Stealthy Hood just to stop the Giratina discarding the coating metal energy. Well, now you don't even have to play anything like that. You can probably even drop the coating metal energy down to a 1 or 2 count because you know once it's on the board, once it's established on a Corviknight, it can't be discarded with Giratina, which is really nice for those fire matchups that typically have been a real thorn in Luca Metal's side, even with the release of coating metal. So yeah, we can really see this being potentially a very, very strong archetype. And like we said when discussing Cheryl in the trainers video, just getting 1 turn and meeting your opponent, meaning that you don't lose the game for a turn, can sometimes mean you win the game, especially when you're churning out 230, 240 damage turn after turn. All of a sudden, 1 turn can be 240 damage, which can be 3 prizes in this meta. So obviously, that's absolutely massive. And now Luca Metal doesn't play these stage 1 lines, but because you're leaning into the stage 1s a little bit more, you can play less of a wacky support account. You know, we have tag team supporters, which can be great, but they don't have that massive discard draw of things like research and stuff. And typically, the tag team package is a little bit thicker in Luca Metal lines. Well, now maybe you can cut back on that tag team package, maybe even go down to 1 Luca Metal and just play a more standard support account. And once you've established Corviknight and Bronzong, you know, you've already got the ball rolling already. Even if you don't get to full Metal Wall, maybe you'll only full Metal Wall in matchups where you want to be discarding energy off of a threat rather than particularly getting that extra 30 damage because extra 30 HP, I should say, because with Goggles and 320 HP, as well as Cheryl, you might just have enough defense anyway. So being Metal type is obviously great. You have access to Saucer and Zacian, as well as Intrepid Sword early games that have the bonus effect of being able to attach energy for tempo. Brave Blades as well. All in all, this just sounds like a more well-rounded Luca Metal archetype that probably takes a bit of a hit on some of the key matchups that Luca Metal just auto wins. But in general, I think it picks up percentage points in a couple of Luca Metal's more awkward matchups and becomes a much more consistent and kind of standard, deck with like kind of a standard game plan rather than just kind of, you know, tag calling and hoping you can get there and hoping you can just get over the line to where Brave Blade, you know, like I say, gets you there. Instead, it feels like you can actually be the aggressor, but also with the addition of Cheryl, really be on the defensive position and still just out-resource your opponent.
Yeah, it's actually a strange way of thinking about defense because a lot of the time at the moment, Luke Metal with like Zamazenta and Marnie Doll plus like Intrepid Sword is the way that you buy free turns. Whereas here you're buying free turns in a much more obvious way in that you're undoing damage that's already been put on you. But this Corviknight is just such great synergy for you. It lets you be super proactive. You can sit with game on board with this card like so easily because you've got too much hit points to be dealt with in one turn with the Full Metal Wall and the goggles on top of the natural hit points. You take your big hit. If they're going to gust up your Bronzong, you reset the G-Max Hurricane anyway. And if they don't, you can just free retreat out into your next Zacian and continue a chain of Brave Blades. So far more aggressive than the Luke Metal that we know right now. And like you say, I much prefer having a more standard draw engine. It means you're not going to get donked so much with just like a randomization that you start Intrepid Sword pass. You're going to have way more outs to actually just get into the game. And you can actually have random high rolls as well with Bronzong. You can high roll into like turn 1 Full Metal Wall or turn 1 Brave Blade. Those sorts of attacks can happen just because you have Bronzor. When you go second, you can evolve straight up into Bronzong. And then you can just use like sources and attachments to actually ramp into some of these attacks. Even ramping into Steel Fist turn 1 can be really good value for you because you get more into play that you can then shimmy around later on. So yeah, a ton of random high rolls by having like a better draw engine and having Bronzong just there to make your sources more available and makes you have a sort of different number of outs to get earlier game attacks. Obviously, you sit back in Intrepid Sword on turns as well. You have that defensive package. And ultimately, I just feel that Corviknight spamming 240 in and out of Brave Blade is better than just saving turns, Intrepid Sword passing, or putting a doll in the active plus Marnie and hoping they don't have boss. This is a much more pressure-based way of defending against the opponent, which is really, really cool, I think, and very, very strong. And like you said, the best VMAX option that we have. So we then have Stoutland V. It's a 210 hit point colorless basic that has the second Fang attack. For 3 colorless energy, you just do 40 damage. Doesn't sound too scary until you read that if the defending basic Pokemon is knocked out by damage from this attack, take 1 more prize card. Oh no, they've done it again. They've taken additional prize card text on another Pokemon. And the good news is this is expensive, needs acceleration, and is currently doing a low base damage output, so it's quite niche. It's only into basics as well, which is a little bit of help here and there, but there are actually a few things you can think about here that sets this 40 damage up quite nicely, unfortunately. Cramorant spit-shotting like a Crobat could then put it in range for a second Fang for 3 prizes later on. If you're playing Welder, you can use Flare Strike for 230, and then second Fang on a follow-up Welder means you can take 4 prizes into opposing tag teams. So there's a ton of cards in this format that, in Battle Styles, the set, that could be punishing tag team gameplay. So that's something to bear in mind for sure. Obviously, there's the meme that you play this in like ADP and then take like 3 prizes on a Buttlebee or something like that. But I don't think its actual natural home is going to be ADP. It doesn't make much sense when you just have such good attacks available to you that you don't need the Stoutland to like bring you back into the game. It feels more so like it'll be placed into the Reshizar deck, maybe the new fun Cramorant VMAX deck using Porygon Z and Powerful Colorless, where you can push that second Fang into ranges where you can deal with like Jirachis for 2 prizes, that sort of thing. At the moment, it sounds really glamorous. Obviously, the Wild Tackle isn't an attack that we care too much about either, just 200 for 4, not super efficient, not dealing with a lot of V Pokemon, unfortunately. But yeah, this is intimidating. It may find its way into the random like Ditto V Welder box, but at the moment it's quite niche, fortunately, because it's a scary effect.
And that wraps up the Vs and VMAXs for Battle Styles. You can take a quick pause here to have a look at kind of our global ratings, but you can see we're all about the Rapid Strike Urshifu over here. But that being said, like we said with the single strike, that doesn't mean we think it's bad. We think Corviknight is another very key player. We think Victini is another out-the-box, very strong archetype. And Empoleon is going to see a lot of play in these Rapid Strike variants. And Kricketune is just great sort of stamp-proofing, anti-stamping, and a lot of other random sort of highlight reel Pokemon as well. So yeah, pretty interesting. You can compare our sort of scores to the communities right here as well. Again, we've been a little bit more favorable on some of them, dropping no 3 stars and a couple more 4 stars than the community. But as this usually goes, we're also dropping a few more 1 stars as well. So we've been pretty feast or famine this time, which I think we always try to aim to be. We don't really want to be middle of the road. This might be okay. We either want to commit to this is going to see play or this is going to fall off. And I think this is a set that's had more very playable cards. Like all 5 of these cards on the screen, I think are very exciting to see and will really shake up the metagame, which we haven't been able to say that for the past couple of sets. So yeah, really interesting stuff, and I'm really excited to get involved with some of these decks, especially Rapid Strike Urshi. I'm so looking forward to busting these day one and start Gale Thrusting and Gmax Rapid Flowing Dedenes and Crobats everywhere.
Going to be a ton of fun. Thanks so much for watching, guys. This was the second part of our set review. You can go back and watch our trainer review if you'd like. And tomorrow we will be uploading the final part, which is going to be the one prizer section of the set review. Hope you guys did all enjoy. Did you think differently about any of these cards? Tell us down below what we got right, what we got wrong, what you're going to be playing first day of ladder. Thanks so much, guys, and we'll see you in the final part of the set review tomorrow. Cheers.